16 people trapped inside a cable car, suspended in the air, for 8 straight hours after the ground stopped shaking beneath them. That's one single detail out of an earthquake that has now killed well over 200 people across Colombia. And I want to walk y'all through exactly what happened, why this particular region is so vulnerable, and what's still unfolding right now as rescue crews keep working. It is Tuesday, August the 11th, and this is a real ongoing disaster. So I want to be upfront that some of the numbers I'm about to give you are almost certainly going to keep changing in the wrong direction as search and rescue efforts continue. On August 10th, 2026, a magnitude 7, 4 earthquakes struck the department of Chocó in Colombia, and as of the most recent reporting, it has killed at least 224 people, injured more than 1,200 others, and left more than 3,700 people reported missing, with extensive damage across the country. The earthquake's epicenter was located about 3 miles east of the town of San José del Palmar, according to the U.S. Geological Survey. That epicenter sits roughly 250 miles west of Bogotá, and the quake struck at about 8:34 in the morning Eastern Time, followed less than an hour later by a magnitude 5. 0 aftershock. By Tuesday morning, nearly 100 aftershocks had already been registered since the main shock. I want y'all to understand just how far this shaking reached, because this wasn't a localized event confined to one small area. The earthquake was felt across much of Colombia and even in parts of neighboring Ecuador and Panama. Witnesses reported feeling the shaking as far away as the capital, Bogotá, and even in Barranquilla on the Caribbean coast, and it was felt across the border in Ecuador as well, with an estimated 5 million people experiencing strong to very strong shaking. That's an enormous population exposed to genuinely dangerous shaking intensity from a single earthquake, and it's part of why the damage report spans so many different cities rather than being concentrated in just one location. Let's talk about where the worst of the destruction has actually happened, because the damage isn't evenly spread. The quake caused extensive damage in Cali, Pereira, Quibdó, Manizales, and other areas. Pereira, the city named specifically in this story's headline, has been one of the hardest hit. Of the confirmed deaths, 60 occurred in Pereira alone, according to an update from the Colombian Association of Capital Cities. Across the affected region, 5 capital cities have been placed under red alert, 86 buildings have collapsed, and 7 airports have suspended operations. That cable car incident I opened this video with happened right there in Pereira as well. 16 people were trapped in an aerial cable car system in the city for 6 hours before being evacuated. I want to give you all a sense of what rescue crews are actually dealing with on the ground right now, because this is still very much an active, unfolding response, not a cleanup operation. Rescuers have been working through the night with cranes, excavators, and at times their bare hands, cutting through twisted steel and passing buckets of debris in searches for people still trapped beneath the rubble. Entire sections of residential neighborhoods have been reduced to broken slabs of concrete and exposed rooms, and residents and volunteers have been forming human chains while others stand silently nearby, listening for tapping sounds or cries coming from underneath the debris. One witness, who was actually live streaming from Pereira's airport when the quake struck, described crouching under a table as parts of the ceiling came down around him, and said that afterward he walked across the city on foot for 2 hours because there was no way to drive, describing scenes he called devastating, with injured people bleeding and screaming, and unable to reach their families because there wasn't any cell signal. Let's talk about why this particular part of Colombia is so earthquake-prone in the first place, because I think understanding the underlying geology helps explain both why this happened and why this region has a documented history of destructive earthquakes. Colombia sits at a genuinely complex tectonic crossroads where the Nazca Plate is subducting, meaning sliding underneath the South American plate along the Pacific coast, and that ongoing subduction process is the same basic mechanism responsible for the volcanic and seismic activity that runs the length of the Andes Mountains through South America. The specific region hit hardest by this earthquake, stretching from Chocó through Risaralda, where Pereira is located, and into the broader coffee-growing region of the country. It sits close enough to that subduction boundary and to a number of complex related fault systems that it has a long documented history of significant damaging earthquakes. And this isn't the first time this exact region has been devastated by a major quake. The area hit by this earthquake is part of Colombia's so-called coffee axis, a mountainous, culturally, and economically important region. And it was also the site of a major earthquake back in 1999 that killed nearly 1,200 people. I bring that up not to pile on more grim statistics, but because it matters for understanding the building and infrastructure vulnerability at play here. A region that has already experienced one catastrophic, deadly earthquake within the past 3 decades should, in theory, have had significant investment in earthquake-resistant construction and retrofitting in the years since. The scale of collapse we're seeing this week is a sobering reminder of how much work remains in bringing older buildings, in particular, up to a standard that can actually withstand shaking of this magnitude, And it's a pattern that plays out again and again in seismically active regions around the world, not just in Colombia. I want to explain a little more about why building age and construction type matter so much in an event like this, because it's directly relevant to understanding the pattern of collapse we're seeing reported out of Pereira and Cali specifically. Older buildings constructed before modern seismic codes were adopted, or built using unreinforced masonry, meaning brick or block construction without adequate steel reinforcement tying the structure together, are dramatically more vulnerable to catastrophic collapse during strong shaking than newer buildings built to current seismic standards, which are engineered to flex and absorb energy rather than shatter and fall. Colombia has updated its national building code multiple times over the past several decades, generally in direct response to past earthquakes, including the 1999 event I mentioned earlier. But retrofitting existing older buildings to meet updated codes is an enormously expensive, slow process that many cities in Colombia and around the world have not been able to complete across their full building stock, which means a mix of modern, code-compliant structures standing largely intact right next to older, vulnerable buildings that collapsed entirely is a very common pattern after an earthquake like this one, and it's likely part of why we're seeing such a wide range of outcomes, building to building across the same affected neighborhoods. Let me also put the actual size of this earthquake in better context, because I think the number 7.4 doesn't fully land for people who aren't used to thinking in terms of the magnitude scale. Earthquake magnitude is measured on a logarithmic scale, meaning each whole number increase represents roughly 10 times more ground movement and around 32 times more energy released. A magnitude, 7. 4 sits solidly in the range. Scientists classify as a major earthquake, capable of causing serious damage across a wide area. And it takes a genuinely large amount of accumulated tectonic stress, built up over years to decades along a fault or subduction interface, to produce a rupture of this size. For comparison, this earthquake released dramatically more energy than the kind of magnitude 4 and 5 earthquakes we sometimes cover on this channel when we talk about seismic activity elsewhere in the world. Events that get felt and reported, but rarely produce this kind of widespread structural collapse. A 7. 4 is an entirely different category of event. And the destruction being reported out of Colombia right now reflects exactly that. I also want to touch on the role earthquake early warning technology could play in a region like this going forward, because it's a genuinely important piece of the broader conversation about earthquake resilience. Countries like Mexico, Japan, and increasingly the Western United States have invested heavily in earthquake early warning systems that can detect the initial, faster-moving seismic waves from a rupture and issue an alert, sometimes with tens of seconds of lead time, before the more damaging shaking actually arrives at more distant locations. That kind of warning system wouldn't have prevented the destruction we're seeing in this event, since Pereira and the other hardest hit areas were too close to the epicenter for meaningful warning time, regardless of the system in place. But for more distant cities like Bogota, even a handful of seconds of warning can be enough for people to take cover, for trains to slow down, and for critical infrastructure to shut down automatically. And it's part of the broader toolkit that seismically active countries around the world continue to invest in and expand. I also want to talk about the government and international response, because that's a real part of this story too. Colombia's newly inaugurated president, Abelardo de la Espriella, decreed a 3-month economic relief measure for people in the coffee-growing region of Risaralda, speaking from the region's capital, Pereira, and said it broke his heart going through the city center and seeing all the businesses destroyed. Earlier, the president had also sent a video message telling the Colombian people they were not alone, and that his government would do everything in its power to help them through what he called the most difficult moments. The Colombian government has declared a national emergency and launched search and rescue operations across the affected areas. I want to spend a minute talking about the practical mechanics of what a search and rescue operation like this actually looks like in the days immediately following a major earthquake, because I think it helps explain why the death toll and missing persons numbers keep climbing rather than settling quickly. In the immediate aftermath of a major quake, rescue teams generally prioritize what's called the golden window, roughly the first 72 hours after the collapse, when the odds of finding survivors trapped in voids within collapsed structures are highest. Beyond that window, survival odds decline significantly, though rescues well beyond 72 hours do happen, particularly for people trapped in larger air pockets with some access to water. Right now, this disaster is still within, or just past, that critical window, which is exactly why crews are working around the clock with heavy equipment, trained search dogs, and increasingly sensitive listening equipment designed to detect faint sounds or vibrations from people still alive beneath the rubble. I also want to address something directly, because I think it's relevant to a lot of y'all watching this from outside Colombia who might have family, friends, or connections there. If you're trying to reach loved ones in the affected region right now, understand that communication networks in disaster zones like this are frequently overwhelmed or damaged. Cell towers can lose power. Network capacity gets overloaded with call volume, and it can take hours or even days to reestablish reliable contact. Which doesn't necessarily mean the worst has happened. It often just reflects the state of the infrastructure itself. If you're trying to help from a distance, established, reputable international relief organizations with an existing presence in Colombia, along with the Colombian Red Cross, are generally the most effective channels for getting aid to where it's actually needed, rather than trying to coordinate assistance independently into an active disaster zone. I want to say a little more about what effective giving actually looks like after a disaster like this, because I know a lot of y'all want to help and aren't always sure what the most useful way to do that actually is. In the immediate aftermath of a major earthquake, financial donations to established relief organizations are generally considered more useful than shipping physical goods, because organizations already on the ground can purchase exactly what's needed: food, clean water, medical supplies, temporary shelter materials from local or regional suppliers, which is both faster and helps support the local economy during recovery rather than creating logistical bottlenecks trying to import and distribute donated goods into a disaster zone with already strained transportation infrastructure. If you do want to give, look for organizations with a demonstrated existing presence in Colombia and a track record of disaster response, and be cautious of newly created fundraisers or unfamiliar organizations that pop up in the immediate aftermath of a major disaster like this one, since unfortunately, fraudulent charity scams are a documented recurring problem following high-profile disasters. I also want to acknowledge something that doesn't always get enough attention in disaster coverage, and that's the psychological toll an event like this takes on survivors, even those who weren't physically injured. Living through a major earthquake, especially one involving building collapses, trapped victims, and an uncertain ongoing aftershock sequence, is a genuinely traumatic experience. And it's common for survivors to experience acute stress reactions in the days and weeks that follow, difficulty sleeping, heightened anxiety, particularly around any further shaking, and a general sense of disorientation, as familiar surroundings have been physically altered or destroyed. Mental health support, alongside physical rebuilding, is a real and important part of disaster recovery, and it's worth keeping in mind for anyone watching this who has friends or family who lived through this event. Checking in on how they're actually doing emotionally, not just materially, in the weeks ahead is going to matter. I want to close this out by talking briefly about what typically comes next after an earthquake of this scale, because the story doesn't end once the search and rescue phase eventually winds down. In the weeks and months ahead, Colombia is going to be dealing with the enormous task of temporary housing for people whose homes were destroyed or rendered structurally unsafe, structural assessments of thousands of buildings across multiple cities to determine what can be repaired versus what needs to be demolished, and a long economic recovery process for a region that, as we discussed, is economically built around coffee production and tourism, both of which are going to be disrupted for an extended period. Aftershocks are also going to remain a real ongoing concern for weeks to come, with nearly 100 already recorded, and each one carries the potential to further damage already weakened structures or trigger secondary landslides in this mountainous terrain, which adds real danger and complexity to both the ongoing rescue efforts and the eventual recovery and rebuilding process. I'm going to continue following this story as more information comes in over the coming days, because this is very much still developing, and the human impact here deserves accurate, updated coverage rather than a single snapshot treated as the final word. Subscribe to this channel and hit that bell so you catch those updates as they come. And if you're in a position to help, please consider supporting a reputable relief organization working in the affected region. My thoughts are with everyone in Colombia dealing with this right now, and I'll be back with more as this situation continues to unfold. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you all in the next update.